In 2022, a young and almost unknown captain suddenly stepped onto the political stage, Ibrahim Traoré. At that time, Burkina Faso was drowning in crisis terrorist attacks, spreading poverty weighing heavily, and public trust in the old regime collapsing. Traoré did not accept privileges or lucrative rewards. Instead, he became known as a modest commander with a low salary, willing to risk everything for what he called the survival of the nation. Just 2 years later, under his leadership, Burkina Faso made decisions that shook the world, from challenging long-standing military agreements with the West to expelling the United Nations mission from the country. One question echoes: is this reckless defiance, or the first true declaration of an Africa determined to stand on its own? The spark that ignited everything came in late September 22. Burkina Faso, already shaken by relentless insurgent attacks, witnessed a coup that replaced one young officer with an even younger one. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, only 34 years old, stood before the nation and declared that the existing leadership had failed to protect the people. Villages were burning, farmers were abandoning their fields, and families fled in fear from a countryside that had become ungovernable. But this was not simply another coup in Africa's long and painful history. For the first time, a leader emerged who openly refused to bow before external powers. In his first speeches, Traoré pointed to the decades of dependency on former colonial rulers and international institutions. He did not shout empty slogans. Instead, he asked a piercing question: if our soldiers die every day, why are we told to wait for permission before defending ourselves? The world began to take notice. On the streets of Ouagadougou, thousands of young men and women poured out in support, waving Burkina flags, chanting against corruption, and calling for sovereignty. Outside Africa, the event was met with suspicion and alarm. Paris warned of destabilization. Washington expressed concern, and international agencies urged a return to order. Yet for the people of Burkina Faso, the trigger was clear. It was not about politics in distant capitals. It was about survival. A nation tired of waiting for rescue had decided to rescue itself. The coup was not just a political announcement, it was a shockwave that tore through daily life. Almost overnight, the country was suspended between hope and fear. In the villages near Kaya and Djibo, mothers whispered anxiously as food prices doubled. Trucks carrying grain stood motionless on sun-scorched highways, stopped by insecurity and endless checkpoints. Markets that once overflowed with millet and sorghum were half empty, with vendors staring at baskets of unsold goods. Children who should have been in school instead followed their parents on desperate searches for water and safety. In Ouagadougou, the contrast was striking. Crowds filled the main squares, chanting Traoré's name as though salvation had arrived. Young men wrapped in Burkinabe flags climbed onto buses and rooftops, shouting sovereignty or death. Radios blasted songs of defiance, while murals of African heroes like Thomas Sankara suddenly reappeared on city walls, painted overnight by unknown hands. For many, it felt as though history itself had returned. But the uncertainty was overwhelming. Civil servants worried about unpaid salaries. Traders feared sanctions and isolation. International aid groups, unsettled by the rising anti-Western sentiment, began to scale back operations. Families who had survived decades of hardship now asked themselves a brutal question: will this bring freedom or famine? The coup's immediate impact was a paradox: pain and pride, hunger and hope, collapse and rebirth, playing out all at once. It was as though the entire nation had been forced to the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown, waiting to see if Ibrahim Traoré would let them fall or lead them across. As the dust of uncertainty settled, one figure began to dominate the stage: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. To the outside world, he was simply another soldier in fatigues. But to Burkina citizens, he quickly became the embodiment of their collective anger, hope, and defiance. Traoré did not appear in a polished suit behind gilded podiums. He walked into the streets in his camouflage uniform, often without the layers of protection other heads of state demanded. His youth, barely mid-30s, was no longer a liability, but a symbol. He was close enough to the frustrations of ordinary people to feel their hunger, yet bold enough to speak in the language of liberation. In his speech, he did not veil his words. He declared, "We will not be the slaves of our own land. Our soil is ours, our gold is ours, our future is ours." For a generation raised on stories of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president assassinated decades earlier, these words resonated like an echo from the past. Sankara had once promised dignity. Now Traoré promised its revival. The image of the young captain standing on military trucks, raising his fist as thousands roared in unison, quickly became iconic. In villages, old men compared him to the warriors of their youth. In classrooms, children scribbled his name next to drawings of the Burkina Faso flag. Even the skeptical elders, hardened by years of broken promises, admitted that there was something different in the fire of his eyes. International observers dismissed him as inexperienced, reckless, even dangerous. But within Burkina Faso, Traoré was not just a leader, he was becoming a myth in real time. He was the soldier-turned-savior, the man who stepped forward when others hid, and the one voice daring to say what millions across Africa whispered in silence. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré could not remain symbolic for long. After the eruption of support and the surge of emotion, the question turned to action. What would he actually do to change the fate of Burkina Faso? And here the young captain surprised the world with the speed and audacity of his countermoves. The first battlefield was security. Traoré inherited an army exhausted by years of asymmetric warfare, poorly equipped and dependent on foreign training missions. Within weeks, he ordered sweeping reforms. Local militias known as the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland were expanded and supplied. Training camps multiplied in remote provinces. Retired officers were recalled into service, and ordinary citizens were invited to defend their communities. For the first time in years, villagers felt that the army was not abandoning them, but standing shoulder to shoulder with them. At the same time, Traoré moved against the invisible chains of dependency. He demanded the departure of French troops stationed in Burkina Faso, declaring that foreign forces had failed to bring security and that sovereignty could not be outsourced. Paris protested, but within months their soldiers were gone, leaving behind a vacuum that Traoré filled with a new strategy: diversify alliances. His government signed agreements with Moscow, deepened ties with Mali and Niger, and began talks with Turkey and other non-Western partners. Suddenly, Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation long treated as peripheral, was at the heart of a shifting geopolitical game. Economically, the counter-strike was just as bold. Traoré spoke openly about reclaiming control over Burkina Faso's gold and natural resources long dominated by foreign companies. He questioned contracts signed under past regimes, insisted on renegotiating terms, and declared that Burkinabe wealth should serve Burkinabe children before anyone else. In a country where poverty coexisted with vast mineral riches, these words ignited a sense of justice long suppressed. But perhaps his most daring move was cultural and psychological. Traoré framed his actions not merely as political decisions, but as a moral revolution. He told his people, "We must learn again to walk with our own feet. No one will build our country for us." Across radios, markets, and schools, these phrases spread like wildfire. They were repeated in songs, scribbled on posters, painted on buses. The captain was not just issuing orders. He was reprogramming the national mindset. Internationally, the backlash was immediate. Western capitals warned of isolation, aid was suspended, loans were threatened, and newspapers painted Traoré as a radical who would plunge Burkina Faso into ruin. Yet inside the country, the effect was the opposite. Instead of despair, citizens felt a strange new pride. Farmers said they would tighten their belts but keep their dignity. Students declared they would study harder, not to emigrate, but to rebuild their homeland. Women's groups organized rallies with slogans that echoed throughout the Sahel: "Better to stand hungry than to kneel fed." The counter-moves of Traoré then were not just military or diplomatic maneuvers. They were a reorientation of identity. He turned Burkina Faso from a passive receiver of decisions into an active maker of history. Each decree, each speech, each risk he took deepened the sense that this was no ordinary leader, but a man willing to gamble everything, including his life, for the sovereignty of his people. The gamble had only just begun. The counter-moves of Ibrahim Traoré did not remain locked within the walls of government offices or military barracks. They spilled into the streets, the markets, the villages, and even the most intimate corners of daily life. The revolution he called for began to take root, not only in policies but in people's hearts. In the countryside, farmers who had once abandoned their fields because of violence cautiously returned, determined to plant again. Women formed cooperative groups to harvest together, guarding one another in the face of insecurity. Many carried portraits of Traoré into the field, saying, "If he risks his life for us, we will risk ours for our land." Grain markets in towns like Bobo Dioulasso saw merchants display both their products and flags, transforming trade into an act of patriotism. In the schools, children who had grown up amid conflict suddenly had a new vocabulary of pride. Teachers reported that students recited Traoré's speeches like poems, treating them as lessons in history and identity. In classrooms once dominated by fatigue and despair, maps of Africa were now decorated with bold slogans. Burkina will rise. The Sahel will not bow. For a generation accustomed to thinking of their homeland as fragile, the message was electrifying. Among the youth of Ouagadougou, the ripple was even louder. Streets filled with chants and drumming as young men and women organized rallies on their own, often without official permission. They painted murals of Sankara and Traoré side by side with slogans declaring, "The torch has passed." Neighborhoods that had once been fractured by fear became arenas of debate where young people argued passionately about what sovereignty meant in practical terms: education, healthcare, and jobs created by Burkinabe hands. Even in the quiet routines of daily commerce, the ripple was unmistakable. Taxi drivers displayed stickers of Traoré on their windshields. Shopkeepers refused foreign currency in symbolic protest, accepting only the CFA franc with pride, even as inflation bit into their profits. Barbers played speeches of Traoré over radios while cutting hair, and market women sang songs that mixed traditional melodies with lines from his addresses. But perhaps the most profound ripple was emotional. For decades, many Burkinabe had felt invisible, overshadowed by more powerful nations, dismissed by international media as a poor, landlocked country destined to suffer. Now, for the first time in living memory, they felt seen by their leader, by their neighbors, by the world. Dignity was no longer an abstract word, but something that shaped the way people carried themselves. Men walked straighter, women spoke louder, children dreamed bigger. The domestic ripple was not without challenges. Shortages continued and the threat of terrorist attacks remained real, yet the hardship itself became fuel for resilience. "If we starve together. If we fight together," said one woman in a rural cooperative. Her words captured the new ethos. Unity was no longer just a slogan, it was survival. In every village song, in every whispered prayer, in every flag raised high, the presence of Traoré could be felt. He was not merely ruling a country, he was becoming the pulse of a nation rediscovering its will to live free. The domestic surge of confidence in Burkina Faso was only half the story. Beyond its borders, the actions of Ibrahim Traoré triggered waves that rippled across Africa and into the heart of the international system. What began as a national defiance quickly became a continental debate, and then a global spectacle. In the West, the reaction was sharp and immediate. Paris, once the ultimate arbiter of Burkina Faso's politics, bristled with fury. Editorials in French newspapers painted Traoré as a reckless adventurer dragging his people into isolation. American officials spoke of grave concern and threatened to reduce aid while the European Union debated sanctions. Television anchors in Washington and Brussels framed the events as a dangerous turn toward authoritarianism and Russian influence. The language was not new. Africa had heard it before, but this time the tone carried a hint of unease. Perhaps the young captain was not so easily dismissed. Meanwhile, other voices rose in contrast. In Moscow, commentators hailed Traoré as a bold leader standing up against neocolonialism. Chinese media, cautious but approving, highlighted his calls for sovereignty and self-reliance, framing them as part of a broader multipolar future. In Ankara and Tehran, analysts argued that the Sahel was becoming a new frontier of global realignment. For them, Traoré was not just a Burkinabe leader, but a signal that the world order itself was shifting. The ripple was not confined to governments. Across Africa, from Bamako to Niamey to Accra, ordinary people took to the streets in solidarity. In Mali and Niger, already under military rule, massive rallies echoed the slogans heard in Ouagadougou: "Down with imperialism, Africa, for Africans, flags of the three nations," Burkina Faso. Mali-Niger flew side by side, often carried by young men who had never traveled beyond their borders but felt bound by a common destiny. Social media lit up with images of African youths wearing shirts printed with Traoré's face, captioned simply "Hope." Even further afield, the ripple reached diasporas. In Paris, New York, and London, African students marched through European boulevards chanting the captain's name, demanding that the West respect African sovereignty. In online forums and YouTube comment sections, debates raged. Was Traoré a visionary hero or a dangerous populist? Could Burkina Faso survive without Western aid? The very fact that such debates dominated international discourse showed how far the ripple had traveled. Journalists compared him to Sankara Lumumba and even Che Guevara. Global magazines featured his image on their covers, sometimes lionizing him, sometimes demonizing him, but always acknowledging his impact. Universities held seminars titled The New Wave of African Sovereignty, with Traoré at the center of discussion. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso, a country often relegated to the footnotes of geopolitics, was front-page news. Yet the most profound global ripple was psychological. For young Africans watching from Nigeria, South Africa, or Kenya, Traoré's defiance felt like a mirror of their own frustrations. If a small, landlocked, impoverished nation could dare to challenge the West, then perhaps their own countries could too. Sovereignty, once dismissed as a dream, suddenly seemed like a possibility. Burkina Faso's defiance had become Africa's defiance, and Africa's defiance was becoming the world's reckoning. To understand the true weight of Ibrahim Traoré's rise, one must see him not only as a man of the present, but as part of a lineage of unfinished struggles. His words, his choices, and his defiance did not exist in a vacuum. They echoed across history, drawing invisible threads between past and present, between fallen heroes and a new generation. The most obvious parallel, of course, is Thomas Sankara, known as Africa's Che Guevara. Sankara once promised Burkinabe people dignity, women's emancipation, and independence from foreign domination. His assassination in 1987 cut short a revolution that still haunted the nation decades later. When Traoré raised his fist and declared, "Our resources belong to us," it was not just a statement, it was the resurrection of Sankara's dream. Old revolutionaries, their faces lined with grief, whispered that the spirit of Sankara had returned in the uniform of a young captain. But Sankara was not the only ghost standing beside him. From Patrice Lumumba in Congo to Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, Africa, has a pantheon of leaders who dared to confront colonialism and paid with their lives. Traoré's speeches, often short and direct, reminded many of Lumumba's final letters, where he insisted that history would remember those who fought for freedom, even if their enemies triumphed in the moment. The symbolism extended beyond Africa. In the United States, parallels were drawn to the civil rights movement. Scholars compared Traoré's rejection of external control to Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of dignity and Malcolm X's uncompromising call for self-determination. In Latin America, he was placed in conversations alongside Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez figures, who challenged Western hegemony and sought to forge independent paths for their nations. Within Burkina Faso itself, symbolism was even more intimate. Village griots, traditional storytellers, wove Traoré's name into old epics, casting him as a warrior in the same lineage as legendary Sahelian kings who once resisted invaders. Drummers at community gatherings beat rhythms not heard since the days of Sankara, as if the music itself had been waiting for a leader bold enough to carry it forward. Internationally, his very image became an emblem. The sight of a young man in camouflage, fist raised, surrounded by masses of cheering citizens, crystallized into an icon, repeated across murals, posters, and digital memes. Whether hailed as a savior or condemned as a firebrand, the symbolism was undeniable. Traoré was no longer just Ibrahim. Traoré, he was a vessel of collective memory, a bridge between past and future, and therein lay the greatest weight. History had shown that Africa's boldest voices often faced brutal ends. Sankara Lumumba, Nkrumah, all had been silenced, exiled, or overthrown. To many, Traoré's rise was not only a revival of hope, but also a haunting reminder. Heroes in Africa often burn bright, but not for long. Would he complete the unfinished story, or would he become yet another martyr in the long chain of betrayed revolutions? Symbolism can inspire, but it can also burden. And on the young captain's shoulders now rested not just the destiny of Burkina Faso, but the unfulfilled promises of an entire continent. The story of Ibrahim Traoré reached its emotional peak, not in quiet offices or diplomatic halls, but in the open air under the burning Sahel sun, where tens of thousands gathered to proclaim that a new chapter had begun. It was in Ouagadougou's Place de la Nation where the climax unfolded. The square, once a colonial monument, became a sea of humanity. Mothers carried infants on their backs. Young men climbed lampposts to wave flags, and elders who had lived through coups, famines, and wars shuffled into the crowd determined not to miss this moment. The air was thick with dust sweat and song. Drums pounded like a heartbeat, and chants rose in waves. Sovereignty, sovereignty. And then he appeared. Traoré, dressed not in gold-trimmed attire but in simple fatigues, stood on the roof of a military truck. His fist shot into the sky, and the roar that followed shook the city. People wept openly, strangers embraced, and children pointed at him with wide, unblinking eyes. In that instant, he was no longer just a man. He was the embodiment of their collective defiance, their hunger, their grief, and their hope. The moment carried the weight of history. It felt as though Sankara himself had returned. Lumumba was speaking again, and the Sahel's forgotten warriors had risen from the dust. A grandmother in the crowd whispered, "We buried Sankara, but God has sent us another." Her words spread through the mass of people like fire, turning the gathering into something more than a rally. It became a resurrection. From above, drones and foreign cameras captured the scene, broadcasting it to the world. For those watching in Paris, London, or Washington, it was unsettling. A leader embraced not by elites, but by the raw power of the people. For Africans across the continent, it was electrifying. Social media overflowed with videos of the rally set to music shared millions of times. Hashtags like #AfricaRise and #Traoré Spirit trended globally, uniting voices from Dakar to Johannesburg to Nairobi. And then silence. Traoré lowered the microphone and spoke slowly, his words cutting through the noise. "We are ready to suffer, but we will not kneel. We are ready to bleed, but we will not sell our land. Burkina Faso belongs to its people, and today, the people have spoken." The crowd erupted not just in applause, but in tears, in chants, in prayer. The square became a theater of catharsis, a collective exorcism of decades of humiliation. In that climax, time itself seemed suspended. The nation was not simply watching a leader. They were watching themselves reflected back with dignity. It was a cinematic moment destined to live in memory. And like all climaxes, it carried both triumph and danger. For every cheer, there was a silent question. How long can such defiance survive? In a world where history has not been kind to Africa's boldest voices, the rallying cries, the clenched fists, and the sweeping declarations were unforgettable. But history is not written in moments alone. Once the drums stopped echoing and the dust settled, Burkina Faso awoke to the sobering reality of consequences. Every act of defiance carries a price, and every price raises questions about the future. Economically, the strain was immediate. International aid, once the lifeline of Burkina Faso's fragile budget, began to shrink. Western donors scaled back, citing concerns about governance. Projects that had funded schools, hospitals, and rural infrastructure were frozen. Prices of imported goods climbed steadily, squeezing families already living on the edge. Yet for many, this sacrifice was framed not as loss, but as investment. "Better to tighten our belts today so that our children do not wear chains tomorrow," one shopkeeper told a reporter. Still, the reality remained. Without external support, could Burkina Faso truly sustain itself? Politically, the country stood at a crossroads. Traoré's popularity soared among ordinary citizens, but governing is a far heavier task than inspiring. His administration faced the monumental challenge of converting chance into policies, creating jobs for restless youth, reforming institutions long corroded by corruption, and ensuring that sovereignty did not collapse into isolation. Even his supporters quietly admitted that symbolism must eventually give way to practical solutions or risk fading like so many revolutions before. On the security front, the struggle continued. Despite the surge of volunteer militias and military reforms, terrorist groups remained active in the north and east, staging attacks and testing the government's resolve. Every successful raid against them strengthened Traoré's credibility. Every failure risked eroding the fragile unity he had built. The question loomed, could a nation fighting for independence also fight and win a war for survival within its own borders? Globally, the consequences reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso. Western governments warned of a dangerous precedent, fearing that Traoré's defiance might inspire others across the continent. In Mali and Niger, military rulers openly embraced him, forming what some called a Sahel alliance of resistance. African youths from Senegal to South Africa spoke of him as proof that courage could redraw maps of power. But would this ripple harden into a true Pan-African movement, or dissolve under the weight of international retaliation? The symbolism also raised philosophical questions. Was Traoré rewriting history, or merely repeating it? Was he the completion of Sankara's dream, or destined to meet the same tragic fate? Could Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation with limited resources, become a model for an entire continent? Or would it become a cautionary tale of pride over pragmatism? Perhaps the most pressing question was one of endurance. Defiance burns bright, but flames consume quickly. Could Traoré transform a moment of rebellion into a system of renewal? Could the collective passion of his people be channeled into institutions strong enough to outlast him? Or would the burden of history, heavy with betrayals and assassinations, once again claim another African leader before his work was done? For now, the answers remain uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the choices of one young captain have already altered the trajectory of his nation and unsettled the balance of a world accustomed to African silence. And so, the future stands as a series of questions unresolved, waiting to be written. Will Burkina Faso become a beacon of sovereignty or a casualty of isolation? Will Africa's defiance spread, forging a wall of resistance across the Sahel? Or will the forces of history, powerful, relentless, merciless, once again crush the dream before it fully blooms? The world watches. Africa waits. And Ibrahim Traoré, still standing tall in his fatigues, holds the pen with which the next chapter will be written. This is not merely the story of a young soldier who rose against the odds. It is not only the tale of one coup, one rally, or one declaration. What unfolded in Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré is part of something larger, a struggle that transcends borders, languages, and generations. For decades, Africa's narrative has too often been written by outsiders. Diplomats drafting contracts in faraway capitals, economists calculating statistics in offices continents away, journalists framing the continent as a perpetual tragedy. But in this moment, for the first time in a long time, Africa is writing its own story again, and the ink is bold, defiant, and uncompromising. Burkina Faso's rebellion is not just about gold mines or foreign troops or diplomatic expulsions. It is about the dignity of ordinary people who have long been treated as invisible. It is about farmers who continue to till their soil despite threats, mothers who cradle their children while refusing to surrender, and youths who believe that tomorrow can be different because they have seen one of their own defy the giants of the world. Traoré himself is not the end of this story. He is a symbol of its beginning. Whether he succeeds or fails, whether he endures or falls, the spark he has lit cannot easily be extinguished. Across the Sahel and beyond, people are asking questions they have not dared to ask for decades. Why must sovereignty be borrowed? Why must freedom come with conditions? Why must Africa wait for permission to be itself? And here is where you, the audience, come in. History is not written by leaders alone, it is written by those who bear witness, by those who choose to amplify truth rather than silence. You are part of this story, the moment you decide to watch, to reflect, to speak. So, I ask you, is this madness or is it courage? Is Burkina Faso's defiance the seed of a new era or the prelude to another tragedy? What do you see when you look at the young captain standing with his fist raised, a reckless rebel, or the voice of a continent demanding to be heard? Share your answer in the comments. Right where you are watching from, whether you're in Ouagadougou, Lagos, Paris, or New York, because your perspective matters. And if you believe Africa deserves to rise on its own terms, write Africa Rise in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe, not just to follow this channel, but to join a movement. Because this is not only about Burkina Faso, this is about the unfinished history of an entire continent. The story is still unfolding, the world is watching. And perhaps, just perhaps, we are witnessing the dawn of something history will remember, not as madness, but as courage.